Hey, welcome to this live stream, and let me know where you're coming from. I always like to know, and if you're part of the replay crew, hello, and let me know where you're coming from when you join. So this is going to be an interesting one about extended chords, and specifically we're going to get into extended chords in the Dorian mode. I had someone ask recently about a video that I did about the Dorian mode, and they're like, yeah, you seem to really like the Dorian mode. What's up with that? And it's because the Dorian mode sounds amazing, and a lot of really great songs are in the Dorian mode, and a lot of great artists like Pink Floyd and lots of others, right? Some of the best songs in the Dorian mode. So want to get into some of the specifics about this mode and how you can navigate it to come up with some really cool sounds, specifically using extended chords. And I'm getting a feel for addressing comments in more real time. So let's see how that goes in this one. So if you have any comments or questions, let me know, and I'm going to be checking that out as we go here on the side. Okay, so when you first get into the guitar or the piano or just music in general, and I'm going to use guitar chord charts as an example here, it can be overwhelming because there are so many chords. You have in the key of C, for example, you have in this example C, C suspended, C flat 5, C add 9, C, and it just goes on and on. Like, we're just in the key of C, and we're starting to get into seemingly obscure and complicated chords. C major 7, C7 flat 9, and it just keeps going. Like, there's so many different chords, and then all these different inversions of the chords. And so something like this is a chord dictionary. It's meant to give you an overview of various possible chords. But just like with the actual dictionary, you wouldn't read the dictionary and be like, okay, I've mastered the language, let me go write a novel right now, or even just a short story, because the words are out of context in the dictionary, just as they are here as well. So it can seem like, what's up with all these chords? Where do they even come from, and how am I supposed to use them? That is definitely not explained here. And not only in this, but in most music resources, chords just aren't really explained. So let's explain where they come from. And we're going to start with the Ionian mode, or the major key. And then we're going to shift into the Dorian mode, and you're going to find that it's actually not that complicated. So let us do that. And we're going to start with a diagram here known as the circle of fifths. So circle of fifths, I talk about this a lot because it is fundamental to music theory. And a lot of times the circle of fifths is relegated to the footnotes because, especially because a lot of traditional methods like traditional notation, they depict the circle of fifths in this abstract way where it's a ring of key signatures. And in other videos, I talk about why that's confusing, but the gist is that it's really just showing how all keys are connected, how they form a single loop or a daisy chain pattern of major scales. So for example, and using a keyboard like this, it's helpful because it shows you the pattern of whole steps and half steps that forms this pattern. So for example, we have in the C major scale, we have C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, or all of the white keys on a keyboard, that's C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. And then the key of G starts on the G note. So G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, G, and so on. So we have G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, G, and so on. So looking at this with all of the colors, same diagram, just with all of the colors. Now, if you're new here, you might be wondering, where do these colors come from? I explain this in way more detail in other videos, but the gist of it is that all of these overlapping keys in the circle of fifths form a seamless pattern, which is analogous to, not only analogous to, it's identical to the color wheel. And every fifth note or the circle of fifths follows the same pattern as the color wheel. And then we rotate those colors into the chromatic scale, and then the pattern is still consistent. So we have C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C is the key of C, and then G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, G is G, and so on. Now, if we were to look at the same diagram one step cleaner and removing the black and white keys, because ultimately we don't really care about sharps and flats and the various letter names for notes. What really matters is the pattern of whole steps and half steps, which is really highlighted here. We have, again, the C major scale, the G major scale, the D major scale, and so on. So we're working with, and we're working towards extended chords in the Dorian mode, but as we are getting our bearings within music, it's made of these cyclical patterns, and it is going to lead us towards making sense of these chords. So that is in a circular formation right here, where it's like this pure theory. This is how the notes relate in music. As they're applied to a fretboard, this is like if you're looking down at the fretboard, if you're right-handed and you keep it, in your hands looking down, you can see that this is the low string, the low E, and then the A string, D string, G string, B string, and E string. And in other videos, again, I explain this in more detail, but each one of these strings is a chromatic scale. And every fret with a shift on the top two strings is a circle of fifths pattern. And so this is, in essence, how the notes are laid out on the fretboard. Now, if we just focus on, say, the notes of the C major scale, fade out the notes that aren't included. In this example, if it were a keyboard, a piano keyboard, we'd be looking at all of the white notes, while all of the notes that are skipped in that pattern are faded here. So now we have, for example, starting on, this is the third fret, fifth string, we have C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, and then we could keep going, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, and so on. There's different octaves of the C major scale as they rise up the fretboard. Now, the cool thing about this is the same pattern can be used to form various chords. But first, let's look at how this pattern can be used to explain various modes. Because the cool thing about music is that so many patterns, much of music, really all of music, Western music based on the 12 tones of the chromatic scale, they all really come back to the major scale. The major scale is kind of like the foundational pattern that explains so much of music. In other videos, I've explained how the major scale is kind of the basis for our vocabulary in music, because the various interval names that we use to refer to different note patterns is based on the series of whole steps and half steps that makes up the major scale. Also, all of the note names in music are based on the major scale. So looking at the C major scale, for example, here at the top, we have the C major scale. So that's C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. I just played this segment right there. And then we could keep going up an octave, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. It's the next octave up here. But it's just the C major scale. Now, another name for C major is Ionian. It's a fancy name, and it's an old Greek term to the ancient Greek region of Ionia. That's all it is the Ionian. And this mode, or this grouping of notes, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half, is the major scale, also known as Ionian. Okay. If we were to start on the second scale degree of this pattern and use that as the bookends, so from D to D, so instead of from C to shining C, you go from D to shining D, we have the Dorian mode. And there was a region in ancient Greece that this is named after. So instead of C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, that's the Ionian mode. The Dorian mode is D, E, F, G, A, B, C, D. So I'll play that one more time without talking over it, and you can hear it sounds a little it's a minor mode, so it sounds a little more pensive and maybe melancholy, or at least a little more moody. It's kind of happy, it's kind of sad, it's a little bit in between. And then if we were to start on the E major, or the note of E, we have the E Phrygian mode, and so on. So all of these 7 modes are derived from the major scale. In this case, the C major scale, they're just permutations of that same pattern. Now, the fact that all of these patterns are derived from the same underlying pattern is going to come into play when we start creating chords from this. But let's look at how different chords are formed from that same pattern. So we have the C major scale. So C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. We have the major scale as our foundation. And then from that, starting on each note and playing every other note in groups of 3, we can form 7 different chords. So again, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. We can play the C major chord, and then that was the C major, and then D minor is that, and then E minor is starting on the E note, playing every other note, and then starting on F, F major, and then G major, A minor, B diminished, and C. So starting on each respective note, kind of like with the modes, if we start on each respective note, but instead of just playing the whole pattern to form a mode, we combine every other note to form 7 different chords. So we have 7 different chords, and these Roman numerals indicate if it's a capital letter, it's a major chord, and if it's a minor or a lowercase numeral, it's a minor chord. And then we have this little diminished chord, which has this little O symbol. So again, 7 chords are C, D minor, E minor, F major, G major, A minor, B diminished, and C major again to round it out. Basically, it's the C major scale on steroids. So that's what the chords are in this mode. Now, you'll notice how there's this interesting pattern. Notice how C shows up in both of these chords. E shows up here, G shows up here, B shows up here. There's this alternating pattern, or this current of every other that connects all these chords. So I'm going to undo some of these lines, and you can see how if we form this undulating wave connecting every other note, we get this pattern, how C major includes C, E, and G, E minor includes E, G, and B, G major includes G, B, and D, and so on. And we could continue that pattern until we eventually cycle back to C. That is what informs the circle of thirds, which is just that pattern of every other note. So C to E, so that's the C major chord. E to G to B is the E minor chord, or the minor 3 in that key. G, B, D is the major 5 chord. B, D, and F is the diminished 7. D, F, and A is the minor 2. F, A, and C is the major 4. A, C, and E is the minor 6. And then we return back to C, E, and G, and the pattern cycles on forever. So this circle of thirds shows how all of the chords within, in this example, the key of C, or C Ionian, are related. They all, just like the circle of fifths, bleed seamlessly into one another. You'll find that as a common theme in music, that these patterns are cyclical, symmetrical, and they're all related because they intertwine. They form this really cool, intricate web of harmonic connections. So the circle of thirds is really cool because it shows how you can form each chord. Now, so far, we're just talking about basic triads. So in this example, let's undo some of these lines. We have, C major, it's just these 3 notes. Or we have E minor, it's just those 3 notes. It's a triad, tri meaning 3. And then, G major is a triad. And so we can look at it as just basic triads, basic chords, and we can look at the circle of thirds as what informs the creation of extended chords. So for example, let's see. Let's get to, we have, if we played C, E, G, and B, let's just continue on up there. We get C, E, G, and we can play, sorry. That's a C major 7 chord. Or we could continue on, and instead of just encircling those 4 notes, let's go a little further and encircle that. And what do we get? We get that's a C major 9 chord. And it's called 9 because in the in music, if we were to play the C major scale, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1 and 8 are the same. It's just the octave. And 2, we could continue going up and saying 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Like we could keep going up, just like 1 became 8, 2 can become 9, 3 can become 10, 4 is 11, and so on. So when we play, and this is called, anything past the octave is called a compound interval. I have a post on this in the library that explains what are called simple intervals within the octave or compound intervals past the octave, but that's where the name 9 comes from. It's just 2 and 9 are synonymous names. 3 and 10 are synonymous names for the same scale degree or the same note in that pattern. So we have, so C, E, G, and B form a C major 7 chord because it's C major plus the 7 of that pattern. And then C major plus the 7 plus the 9, C major 9, C major 11, C major 13, and then we don't have a C major 15 because it's the same note. So you wouldn't refer to that. C is already taken care of as the 1. So we could keep going with these different chords and, playing a C major 7, major 9, major 11. That's a C major 11 chord. Or we have a C major 7, 9, 11, 13 chord. So that's a C major 13 chord. And then we wouldn't play C major 15 because C and 15 are synonymous because 15 is 2 octaves above C. So in this way, we can form different chords. Now, what's cool is we're just building each chord based on 1 or C as the root note, but the same idea holds for all of the other chords. So for example, if we were to play an E minor chord, we could play E minor. Okay, so E minor is E, G, and B, or E, G, and B, yeah. That's a triad. Or we could play E, G, B, D. So now we're playing E, G, B, D. That's an E minor 7 because E, the reason that we call D a 7, even though it's the 2 in the key of C, is because in each chord we treat the root note almost as its own little mini 1. For a moment, we're just like saying, okay, let's just treat the root note as the 1 and then call each interval that rises from that what it would be as if that root note were the tonic. So of a given key or mode. So E, G, B, and D, if we were to play E to E, that's 1 and 8. So this 7 is right below E. So that's an E minor 9 chord. And then we can play E, G, B, D, and that's an E flat 9, E minor flat 9. Flat 9 because it is flat. Like normally in the key of E major, you'd have a whole step above the one note. So a flat 9 means it's flatted, and so it has this more dissonant sound. But now that explains why we're starting to get some unusual names in our pattern here, because we're starting to get different interval patterns that, you know, we have a minor third and then a perfect fifth and then a flat 7 and then a flat 9. And so that chord has an unusual name. And I'm going to show a table that summarizes these different chords that are built upon these different scale degrees. But this is basically where extended chords come from and where their strange names arise. So now we have this chord that is an E minor flat 9 with an 11. So it's an E minor flat 9 11. So if you were to find this book and look it up, I don't even know if this has that in there, but let's see. E minor, looking for the key of E. E minor, do they even have it? Flat 9, E minor, E minor 11 with a flat 9, like it would be inserted in there. So all of these different chords come from starting on different chords within various keys and modes to come up with these crazy names. But it really just comes back to the circle of thirds that explains the underlying pattern that forms these crazy chord names. So with that in mind, we're looking at the key of C major or C Ionian, with C, a major 1, as the root note, as the home base. But you can see every chord, you know, can build its own extended chords based on the circle of thirds. Now, before we saw that, let's go back to the modes table. We've been building a bunch of, let me get rid of some of these lines. We've been building a bunch of different chords and extended chords based on a circle of thirds that arose from this pattern, from the Ionian mode, when we did every other note in Ionian to form that circle of thirds. But if we were to start on, let's say, the Dorian mode's root note or tonic here, we have that same every other pattern applies. And so we could form a circle of thirds based on any mode. What's cool, though, is that it's the same circle of thirds, because we're just treating a different root note as the tonic. So instead of labeling this minor 2, we would call it minor 1. Instead of calling this a major 4, we'd call it a flat major 3. Instead of calling this a 6, we'd call it a minor 5. Instead of calling this a 1, we'd call it a flat major 7. This would be a minor 2. This would be a major 4 chord, and this would be a diminished 6. Now I'm going to have a diagram coming up that shows it with actual typewritten numerals that makes it easier to read. But you can see here, it's because the Dorian mode is just a permutation of the Ionian mode. The same idea of different chords arising in that mode and building different extended chords is the same. So once you learn this idea of the circle of thirds and extended chords within one mode, like the Ionian mode, you've basically already learned all of the different chords and extended chords for all of the other modes that are relative modes and share the same underlying pattern of circle of thirds, if that makes sense. If it doesn't make sense, or even if it does, I'm going to elaborate on that a bit more to show, okay, so the Dorian mode, for example, in the Ionian mode, in the table above, we showed how C was the 1, and then we just built, you know, a major 1 chord, and then D minor was a minor 2, so we played a minor 2, and then E minor was the minor 3, F major was the major 4, and so on. But since the Dorian mode is a permutation of Ionian, we're going to start with that as the root note, with D as the 1. In this case, it's a minor 1 because it forms a minor chord that every other pattern. And then as a result, E minor now becomes a minor 2. So it's E, G, and B, E minor, but it's a minor 2. F major is now a flat major 3 because F is a flat 3 in relation to D. When D is 1, F is a flat 3. And G is a 4, A is 5, B is 6, and C is flat 7. So, for example, C is the flat 7 scale degree, but it's a major chord, so it's a major flat 7. Hence the crazy numerals with flats and all of that you see in music. It seems like, man, what is up with these flat chords? Well, it's a flat chord because it's based on the scale degree of flat 7, but it's a major chord, so it's a flat major 7. Now, something to keep in mind with modes is that it can be easy to think of. Modes can be confusing because if we go back to the circle of fifths, the circle of fifths highlights every major scale. So again, C major is this grouping. G major is this grouping where it has an F sharp note due to the underlying pattern of whole steps and half steps. And then D major also has an F sharp note and a C sharp note. And so D major is based on that pattern of whole steps and half steps. The D Dorian mode in our example here, we're talking about D Dorian. So we have D major over here, or D Ionian. All of these groupings are just different groups of Ionian. But remember, the different relative modes like Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, Aeolian, and Locrian are permutations of Ionian. So you can see here, for example, that if we look from D to D, where we're starting on the D as the second scale degree within C Ionian, that pattern of whole, half, whole, 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 half, whole is the pattern of Dorian. So this is Dorian, D Dorian, so D Dorian, and this is D Ionian. So in the circle of fifths, all of the main patterns showing major scales, those are Ionian, and then the subsets or permutations of Ionian show up as modes within the circle of fifths. So with that in mind, let's look at how we're going to, well, with that in mind, you can see how if we look at D Ionian or D major, with that major third and that major seventh, or F sharp and C sharp, so we have D, E, F sharp, G, A, B, C sharp, D. It has that kind of jaunty, happy sound of Ionian, D major. It's very different from D Dorian, which has a flatted third and a flatted seventh because it's a permutation of C, which doesn't include any sharp notes. So D Dorian, so I'll play D Ionian again compared to D Dorian. So D Ionian, and then D Dorian. It's a little more subdued. It's a little cooler. It's a little smoother. It's not so happy as the D Ionian, to use very subjective adjectives. It's kind of tricky when you start trying to qualify the sound of modes, but you can tell the difference. Forget my adjectives, just you can hear it yourself. So again, Ionian versus Dorian. Dorian. So this would be a circle of thirds, or is a circle of thirds, based on D Ionian, where we have a C major, or a C sharp, pardon me, and an F sharp. But we're going to look at D Dorian, which again is a permutation of C major. So it instead has a C note and an F note, not C sharp and F sharp. I'm trying to get rid of those. I added a lot of lines. Okay. So again, D Dorian, if D is a permutation of D Dorian is a permutation of C major, we have this C, which is not a C sharp, not a sharp 7, and we have this F, which is not an F sharp. It's not an F. It's not an F sharp. It's an F. So we're going to see how those differences form a different vibe, a different set of chords to use in the Dorian mode. So we're talking about the piano a lot here in terms of chords, and we're looking at tables specifically, but this is a diagram in the library if you want to check it out that has the, and I have these for different keys and modes, but you can see how if we were to look at this in a guitar chord format, we have Ionian, key of C, so C, D minor, E minor, F, G, A minor, B diminished, and C. That is C, D minor, E minor, F, G, A minor, B diminished, and C. Notice how Dorian is the same chords. It's the same chords, only it's treating D minor as the one, as the starting point. So now we have D minor, E minor, F major, G major, A minor, B diminished, C, and D minor. So and so with that, treating D minor as the minor 1 gives us a different kind of sonic palette to work with, but it's no different. Like it's a different sonic palette, but it's the same paint to work with because it's the same grouping of chords. And the same is true for Phrygian, Lydian, Mixed Lydian, Aeolian, and Locrian. They're all just permutations of the same underlying pattern, but treating each respective chord as the tonic or as the home bass for that mode. Now, with these diagrams, we're just looking at triads. So D minor includes 3 notes, D, F, and A. Or E minor includes 3 notes, E, G, and B, and so on. But let's look at the extended chords because that's where it really starts to get interesting and you can get some more nuance and some more sonic variety. Let's see, let's move past that for now. So let's treat D minor as the minor 1. And we have 1, flat major 3, minor 5, flat major 7, minor 2, major 4, and diminished 6. So if we play D, F, A, and C, we get a D7 chord, D, F, A, and C. And if we add a 9, we have D, F, A, C, and E. So that's a D9 chord. And then if we add this G, we get D, F, A, C, E, and G. That's a D11 chord. And we add the B, and we have a D13. Now, a lot of times you're not going to hear chords that are that full, but you do like in jazz, or you can hear chords that kind of like use only subsets of these extended chords to add some variety. It might not include all 7 notes of, say, a D13 chord. It might include, it might drop some of the notes to fill less harmonic space, but it gives more dissonance, more nuance. And so instead of just playing a D minor, which is a fine sounding triad, you can play. It's like being able to kind of play different extended chords. You can really start to create some cool songs, and you can get more creative with melodies, or it can different extended chords can inspire melodies or lyrics that it's like, oh, that's a little more like there's more dimension to that. Maybe I can that can lead me into a new direction based on extended chords. So Ionian in this table summarizes what we looked at for C major extended chords, specifically starting on C. So, if we just do this loop, so we're, going around the circle of thirds, adding incremental notes to build more and more extended chords, we start with C major. So this M, capital M, means C major. So C, E, and G are intervals 1, 3, and 5. And then we could play a C major 7 chord. So that is right here. This triangle means major 7. So it's C, E, G, B. So we added another note. And then if we add another one, C, E, G, B, D, we have a C major 9 chord, which is right here. So it's a triangle for major 7 plus the 9. So C, E, G, B, D. And that gives us that chord, and then, and so on. Now, this table shows all of the variations of possible chords built from this loop of thirds. So from this single loop of thirds, the single circle of thirds, a variety of kind of funky looking extended chords can be formed. And that's, again, treating the 1, in this case, C, as the tonic. And then we can build all of these chords. Now, looking at the second chord, or in the key of C, so in this case, treating D as 1, the minor 2 chord, we can build a variety of chords. So D, F, and A is a minor chord, shown by this little minus symbol. So D, F, and A. So it's D, F, and A, or intervals 1, flat 3, and 5. Again, even though in the key of C, C is 1, to build extended chords, we treat each respective root note as the 1 to build out the different chords. So intervals 1, flat 3, and 5, or in this case, D, F, and A, form a D minor chord. And then D, F, A, C, we have a minor 7 chord, which is right here, a minor 7. So D, F, A, and C. Add the 9, we have a minor 9 chord because it's D, F, A, C, and E. Add a G, minor 11, D, F, A, C, and E, plus an 11. And then just like the other diagram, all of these different chords are derived from this circle of thirds, again, starting with D as the root note or as the foundation for these extended chords. So this is a whole other set of interesting looking chord names that if you were to see it in a table like this, you'd be like, where on earth did these names come from? Where do they come from? It's just based on different patterns that are largely derived from the circle of thirds. Now, we could go on and, build out chords based on E minor. So in the key of C or D Dorian, either way, this E chord is, a position within the circle of thirds, and we can build extended chords based on that. And, starting on F as the root, we can build a bunch of different chords on that. And you can see how, whoa, some of these names are starting to get crazy, but they're only crazy because of the naming conventions we have in music. The different letters and numbers, which I talked about in the last live stream, can be the source of confusion because letters and numbers are not well suited to the cyclical patterns of music, whereas the colors and shapes in all of these examples, they are consistent. So even though these numbers and the labels, the letters are staying consistent because they're the root note name, but as the numbers are shifting, it could be disorienting if we were using only letters and numbers. But with the colors and the shapes, they are like these visual conceptual anchor points that you can see from one diagram to the next. that's the same loop. It's the same loop of root notes. It's just that the numbers have shifted. And so to be able to pin down or conceptually wrap your arms around, okay, this pattern is consistent, the circle of thirds is consistent, it's just we're treating each respective note as its own root and then building out extended chords from that. That's what accounts for these strange names. Suspended sharp 4, because B is a tritone or a sharp 4, in this case a sharp 11 from F, when F is the root note. So that's why that's a sharp 4. So that's how we can form all of these this variety of chord names, all from this one single circle of thirds loop. And again, the circle of thirds loop is, I'm just going to skim past because it's the same idea. I'm just building the different chords. And all of these diagrams are in the library if you want to check that out. I'll include a link in the video notes. But here you can see that, well, that's the last one of those chords. So D Dorian, again, is a permutation of C Ionian. So if we treat D minor as the 1, then we can, build out different chords based on that D minor chord. So this is a nice side by side. So C Ionian is the key of C major, and D Dorian is a mode or permutation of that pattern. But notice how side by side, you can't miss the fact that they are the same circle of thirds. It's just that D is 1 instead of minor 2. In the key of C, where C is the head honcho or the star of the show, where it's the tonic and the point of resolution, the focal point, in D Dorian, D becomes the main point, the point of resolution. So instead of being relegated to a less important number than 1, now D is 1. But again, it's the same circle of thirds. It's the same pattern. And from that, we can derive all of the extended chords that are compatible. So that's another thing about the chord charts in a chord dictionary is when you look at chords in a chord dictionary, it is overwhelming. Again, it's like looking at the words in a dictionary. You can't form a poem or write a book or write any kind of story just knowing the words in a dictionary, just like you couldn't write a song knowing the various chords in a chord dictionary. Knowing how the words, to use the metaphor of, let's say, English in this case, knowing how words combine to form meaning and to tell a story is where storytelling comes into play. You can't just know words. You have to know how the words are connected to form various sentences, paragraphs, pages, chapters, and whole books. Just like you need to know how various chords are related, how certain chords are compatible with each other, it's because of how they are related within a given key and mode. And the circle of thirds explains how all of these extended chords are formed and how you can then look at a chord dictionary like this and know where the chords come from and how they're related. So let's look at the, so again, looking at this side by side, D Dorian, D is a minor 1, D Ionian, or C Ionian, pardon me, is a minor 2 chord, same pattern. And in D Dorian, F is a flat major 3, when D is a minor 1. And in the key of C, F is the major 4. So different Roman numerals, different labels, same pattern. Just for good measure, we'll look at A in the key of C. A is the relative minor to C. It's the minor 6. But in D Dorian, it's a minor 5 because A is the 5th note of D in the circle of fifths. But because of this loop, because it's a minor chord, A minor, it's a minor 5 or a lowercase 5. And I'm including all these diagrams in the post that goes with this so that you can really play with these patterns and, put theory into practice by, finding these patterns on an instrument and playing the patterns. But all of the same all of the same extensions apply to all of the chords, whether this is a minor chord, a D minor chord in C Ionian, or in its own mode of D Dorian. And so you can build various chords, extended chords based on these modes. And you'll notice that all of these chords that are built on the flat major 3 are the same extended chords in the key of C when F is the major 4 chord. So the underlying Roman numeral, so whether F major is a flat major 3 in D Dorian or it's a major 4 in C Ionian, it doesn't really matter in terms of what extended chords go with it, because this loop is the same. It's just that the Roman numeral has changed based on which respective root note is the tonic of a given mode. That's a lot of jargon. Music theory is a mouthful for sure. Let me just kind of jump into... So this is where this diagram is helpful, because you have the circle of fifths, which I explain at length in other videos about how different groupings of chords, say, for example, C major is these 7 chords, where we have this grouping of chords that arise in the key of C Ionian. And then here's the circle of thirds loop above that grouping. But if we're treating C as 1, it's C Ionian. If we treat D minor as 1, it's the same grouping of 7 chords to form D Dorian, and it's the same circle of thirds to form the extended chords. So you can see how the chords are related and grouped together within a given mode, and how to build the extended chords of that respective mode all in one spot. And because music is cyclical and symmetrical, the same holds true if we're looking at the key of A, for example. You know, we have these 7 chords in the key of A Ionian. But if we were to look at B minor as its Dorian mode, its relative Dorian mode, the same pattern forms extended chords in the key of A Ionian, or B Dorian would be in that spot, just like you have C Ionian and C Dorian. And you can see that within any of these circle of thirds, Dorian, in the circle of fifths, Dorian is in that spot compared to Ionian, and it's in the circle of thirds, it's in that spot compared to Ionian, and it's consistent across all keys because music is cyclical and symmetrical. So once you know what you're looking at, a pattern like this, which can look crazy and like a Stargate to a different dimension, is really just a very predictable pattern, a very organized pattern, because music at its core is beautiful. It's cyclical, symmetrical, and totally predictable, ultimately, which you can use to your advantage when it comes to creating songs. So you're not hunting and pecking and randomly hoping that you find chords and notes that go well together. You know how they go well based on the underlying theory. So that is what I wanted to cover in terms of Dorian extended chords. I'm getting a feel for things. Maybe I moved a little fast or kind of skimmed over some key points. But once you know the chords in a given mode and know that all of the modes are permutations of each other, you can play with those same chords, whether they're triads or extended, in any mode, and the chords are compatible. They work well together. So that is Dorian extended chords in a nutshell. There were a couple of housekeeping items I just want to talk about before wrapping it up here. In case anyone had any questions, I'm happy to answer those too, or any comments. And actually, let me jump into questions first. So on John Gibney, you said, question, let's see, let me open that up. Knowing these extensions, how do we decide to use a 9th, 11th for a 7th, for example? We can match a melody note, but what other methods are there to help us use the extended chords? That's a great question, John. So I'll need to dive into that in more detail, like in much more detail in other videos. But the gist is, so for example, like the Beatles, I'm going to use an example of the Beatles because I love the Beatles. So in the early days, they're writing Love Me Do, it was all triads. Like there was, in fact, they were incorporating some seventh chords, but not really delving into extended chords like ninths and 11ths. Whereas like the Beach Boys, Brian Wilson, they were more advanced in terms of starting to get more harmonic nuance, more than the Beatles were earlier on. So in other words, the Beach Boys were getting more creative and inventive and exploring harmonic space at a faster pace than the Beatles in the beginning. Now, as the Beatles started to get more far out and start to get more creative with their songwriting, they did start getting into more extended chords. And their use of extended chords was to match the vibe of a given song. So a song like Fool on the Hill, gets into some ninth chords, and the use of the ninth chord, if I'm thinking the right song, it is like, it adds more dissonance to the harmonic progression. If you know the song Fool on the Hill, it's a little more, it's like he's kind of philosophizing or thinking about this fool who's sitting on a hill. It was a commentary piece, and it was not just the jolly Love Me Do type song. And so by adding that, going with a ninth chord instead of a seventh, he could have played a seventh, but adding the ninth did add the kind of nuance that he was going for, that helped move that song in a different direction had he gone with smaller chords. I know that's maybe not answering your question. Well, I know it's not answering your question in totem, if that's the right phrase. But that's a great question. And there are some methods to inform the use of certain chords. Part of it is feeling it out and liking a certain sound. I recently saw an interview with Sting with, what's his name? It was like back in the day. It was like in 1982. And the guy was asking him about writing Message in a Bottle. And he was like, yeah, I started playing I think it was like an A minor 9 and a D9. And no, it was I think it was a D minor 9, and I can't remember what the progression is. I need to look at it. But basically he was like, I really like the sound of it. Now, Sting comes from a jazz background. So, he had some of those chords in his back pocket or his front pocket to, pull from and be able to play. But, had he just played triads, it wouldn't have sounded as interesting and wouldn't have lent itself to what we now know as such a great song. Mars, seems like knowing how to build a chord progression from a melody is easier to break out of the box than a melody from a chord progression feeling like scale lines. So let me read that again to make sure I'm soaking it in. So you said, seems like knowing how to build a chord progression from a melody is easier to break out of the box than a melody from a chord progression feeling like scale lines. That's an interesting point. And there are different ways to go about it. A lot of times, songwriters start with a melody line because, and this is interesting because lesson 12 in the course, I get about talks about the different layers of music and how the melody and the harmony move in tandem through a song, how they're related and where that connection lies, how they can stick together from one measure to the next. And actually, I'm working on lesson 13 right now, which is the art of songwriting. That I'm about halfway through the illustrations for this lesson, so I'm just like hitting it hard, and that's partly why I've been a little more quiet on some of the social media platforms, because I've just been hammering that hard. So lesson 13 talks about how you can have different starting points. So there are various exercises and explanations of how, you can start with rhythm, or you can start with harmony, or you can start with melody, or you can start with the lyrics. And it's different approaches. Many roads lead to Rome, as the saying goes. And so, sometimes some songwriters have a certain kind of style that they start with. I was listening to an interview with Paul Simon today, really interesting, with Malcolm Gladwell. I think it was from a couple days ago maybe. And Paul Simon is wonderful in that he actually explains his songwriting process and isn't shy or demure about it. Like, he actually just talks about it like it's a thing instead of this big secret. But he was talking about his process for a given song and how it developed and how it came to be. And all of that to say that, because you bring up a good point, there can be, like, if you have a melody line that comes to mind, then reverse engineering it out and building out it or filling in the chord progression is relatively easy. I talk about in lesson, it is this lesson, in lesson 13 that I'm working on, I talk about how Paul McCartney composed the song Yesterday and his order of operations. And he described it that way. He actually started with the melody and then came up with the chord progression to fill it in after that. But if you do start with a chord progression, it doesn't necessarily, to your point, it doesn't necessarily lead to the melody feeling like a scale line or feel almost sterile or just kind of bland because it's just following the chord progression. A lot of times I'll start with the chord progression and it lends itself to different melodies. So, and I've heard of other songwriters going that way too. And it's not that any one songwriter, I'm sure we've all started songs in different ways. We might start with a rhythm that just kind of like, hearing, your washer and dryer doing a certain beat, and it kind of leads itself to a funky line that, builds on from there. There's different approaches, but that's a really good point. And whatever floats your boat, basically, in your approach to the songs. Dave Mercer, thanks for your feedback. Cleared up a lot of music theory tonight. Was a bit confused with modes. Yeah, modes. I used to dismiss modes outright, and it might have been because they were confusing, but I also thought that they were very niche and not as common as they are. And as I got into modes, I was like, man. And once you know modes, looking at chord progressions in songs and like seeing how a song was written, if you're looking at a song that's been written by someone already, modes explain like, oh, that's what's going on there. That's why there's a flat major 7 chord. Like, what the hell is up with the flat major 7? Oh, it's because either it's in a given mode or it's borrowed from a certain mode based on the circle of fifths and, its relationship. So a flat major 7, if we're an Ionian, a flat major 7, it could be the song might be in Mixolydian, or it could be an Ionian where we're borrowing this flat major 7 from a neighboring mode. So it could be a couple of things, and it's based on how the melody line works out and works with the chord progression. It also has to do with, the tonic. What is the one of a given song, the point of resolution in a song? So that, and once you know modes, and that, these are all parallel modes, like in the key of C, Lydian, Ionian to Locrian. They're all just parallel modes and the source of a lot of borrowed chords. And knowing how they're permutations of each other explains so much and can clear up a lot of confusion. I'm glad that's helpful. All right, Mars, you said improving over a chord progression always sounds samey because it's hard to know which notes to play outside of the modes and scales. I can see how that is. And I don't know if you caught the video that I did somewhat recently about pentatonic scales and how they are mode agnostic. And so that's why pentatonic scales in large part are so popular, because they are compatible with the major pentatonic is compatible with Ionian and Lydian and Mixolydian, whereas the minor pentatonic scale is compatible with the minor modes, or Dorian, Phrygian, and Aeolian. And so, that's the thing about the compatibility of patterns, because music is fractal in the sense that it's like Russian dolls. All of these different patterns interlock and are like self-referential and derived from each other. It is truly amazing that so many songs can be written from such a small subset of notes. And so that is always the challenge, is to innovate in creative ways while working with essentially the same things. But I mean, man, if Shakespeare could come up with amazing works using iambic pentameter, if I'm saying that right, where it was like the same rhythmic cadence of lines, that was like the style of the day. And I think that's partly why he's revered as such a prolific, amazing writer. If he was a single person, there are theories that it was multiple people. But if he was able to work wonders within such constraints, the same holds true with music and what we're working with. Yes, to your point, Mars, it's music though, and if it sounds good, it sounds good, which is awesome. And that's the thing about music theory. Sometimes I'll get comments, and I used to have the thoughts myself that music theory was like a wet blanket on creativity and limiting, when in fact, once you see how it works, it's like the lighter fuel that can take the flames to a higher level. Thanks for sharing the video link on the pentatonic. So yeah, the extended chords and how they work within a given key are all based on patterns. Music is patterns. And once you can see the patterns, which is music theory by definition, it's a lot easier to wrap your head around. So the two housekeeping items I kind of spoke to even just in that discussion here, which is lesson 13, the art of songwriting, is I'm making great progress on it. So I'll have more updates as we go, but the illustrations are often like the hardest part. They just take time and are kind of involved. So making great progress on that. And then also with the chord map, I've had a couple of questions for those of you who've gotten some chord maps. I talked about this in an earlier live stream within locals, but I want to speak to it here. Because of the materials used on this, it's multiple layers. So you've got multiple moving layers, which is how it functions to be able to come up with different groupings and see different patterns. Because of the physics of the materials used, this being in essence like they're plastic layers, you can get some static cling. So it's like they might grip to each other and you're like, oh, what should I do? So a couple of things to keep in mind is you can flip this over and kind of an angle there. You can kind of push on it to lift up and release some of the static cling from the middle. But then also you can come over here and kind of pinch a little bit, just gently, to lift up a layer and release the static cling. You can even kind of like loosen it up. Pardon me, you gotta fly in here. So you can kind of lift up the layer to release the static cling, and then it should be able to move smoothly. Now, if the static cling builds up, which it does on mine from time to time too, again, due to the physics of the materials used, you can just lift up that layer again, release the static cling, and you can move again. So if you find it like gripped, it's not that, it doesn't work. It's just that you've got static cling. It's just the physics of it. So yeah, that hopefully is helpful. And that is in essence what I want to talk about, kind of geek out about extended chords in the Dorian mode. And more stuff to come. I'm going to be adding a link and also diagrams that go with this in the library. And thank you for joining me on this. I'm having a lot of fun with these. Kind of skimmed over some of those patterns in maybe too quickly. Love to know your feedback, and this is fun. So thanks again for joining, and I will see you very soon in the next one. We'll see you.